What's going on, everybody? It is that time again. The Sooners Illustrated Podcast, episode 87 on this Thursday, May 30th, 2024. Josh Callaway, Collin Kennedy. We didn't get to do this show last week. Our schedules just didn't line up, so it's been 2 weeks since CK and I lined up for a pod. So we have some stuff to get into, catch up. I missed you last week. Excited to get back here with you, my guy. Recruiting stuff, obviously, we got a lot to catch up on the last couple of weeks. Some offensive line updates we're going to get into, all the recruiting various notes as well. Of course, Jalon Moore on the basketball side. He is back officially. Announced that last night. We'll talk about the ramifications of that a little bit as well on the back end. But CK up first. The Texas game's at 2:30. How do you feel about that? Before we get into some actual meaty things, the Texas game is moved to 2:30. What a weird world we live in.
I'm more upset by the fact that we didn't get to do a podcast last week than I am about the kickoff time of OU Texas, if I'm being honest with you. We were talking about it in the pre-show, man. People forget it's been at 2:30 before.
Yeah.
I don't think this is earth-shattering. I think, if anything, this is kind of just the SEC getting to flex some experimental muscle here. Just see what happens, see what the pros and cons are of moving this game, its first year in the conference, to that time slot. I don't really see a ton of harm done here. And if anything, it allows people a little bit more recovery time in the morning. So
for sure. Well, it's kind of funny, too, because I felt like I slipped almost into another dimension a little bit because, you know, when this was kind of being talked about the last couple of days, I was like, was this not already established? Because when I actually went back and looked at my tweets and stuff from October, whenever they announced that last year's game was going to be at 11, I even said that I had a tweet that said, probably the last one at 11 because this is going to be at 2:30 moving forward because that was kind of the agreed upon thing. Like the ESPN SEC game was going to be at 2:30 still. So the Texas game is at 2:30, which will be a little different. But again, like Collin said, it's been there before. It's not as crazy of a move as it's kind of been made out to be. What is kind of nice is we got a few other kickoff times. So we already knew the Temple game is on the Friday night, which is going to be kind of weird. But then we also got Houston 6:45 and Tulane 2:30. So we have 4 games next year. Not one of them is at 11 yet. So you fans can rejoice. So far, for 4 for 4 on non-11 a.m. It's a whole new world.
You know, I was thinking about this when the announcements came out for the non-con games and then the Texas game. And it's just funny because I was getting asked during the VIP chat, like, some stuff about what are the pros of moving to the SEC? Does it open up new recruiting territories? This, that, and the competition level. Can this program compete in a premier conference? And then the kickoff times drop, and I'm like, you know, we talk so much about the SEC move, but in reality, in all this, just because Oklahoma wanted to play Nebraska beyond 11 a.m. Central. And hey, they're getting their way. So
play one big game, not at 11 a.m., which
I mean,
happening.
This is why Joe C made the move, man. He wanted those later kicks. That's all it was, brother.
Yeah. And it's funny too because you see Oklahoma State, you know, who's kind of obviously they've moved up the pecking order in the Big 12 now. Some of their biggest games have been announced as 11 a.m. They play Colorado at 11, and I think they play Arkansas at 11. Yeah, and it's like, there you go. And they're going to kind of be the beneficiary or, whatever the word is for that now. They're going to play a lot more 11 a.m. So good stuff there for you fans. A little pick-me-up in late May. Some good friendly kickoff times. Some night games. I especially like those night games early in the year because they're just so hot. So nice to get those night games early in the year. But we do have some actual recruiting stuff to get into as well. Like we said, we didn't get to do the show last week. So we have a couple things to kind of catch up on. First, let's kind of backtrack a little bit, and we're going to kind of spinning it forward. But so we talked about him a little bit before, but Anthony Ogamoro, who is down the road in Elgin, guy we talked about on the show a couple times, offensive line prospect. He committed to Tennessee last week. Now this is a pick that you had in as Tennessee, so it wasn't a blind side if you're a VIP member. So I guess if you want, you can kind of tie up the loose ends on that, but also spinning it forward to just kind of where's Oklahoma turning their attention toward now when it comes to offensive line recruiting in that 2025 class as Bill Bedenbaugh looks to stock up after they looked for Ogamoro and didn't end up landing him.
Yeah, so look, and full transparency here, I did change that pick a little bit late, right? But a lot of that was reflective of what had been going on. I think Oklahoma felt really good about where things were going with Anthony Ogamoro, but then just a little bit before decision day, Tennessee was essentially the favorite to land his commitment. And look, I just want to say this is a big recruiting win for Tennessee. I think Anthony Ogamoro has a really bright future. I've heard a lot of great stuff about him off the field, but we've also talked about it here on the show, man. There's a reason why Oklahoma ended up really wanting this guy. Dude has not really been playing football very long, but you can shape his habits in a positive manner. He's got the multi-sport background. He's got a promising frame. And he was kind of one of the few remaining interior offensive line targets on the board there. OU wanted this guy, and I give props to Tennessee for going and getting a player who I think there's a relatively high ceiling there. I think Ogamoro was kind of someone in this cycle who was maybe going to surprise some folks whenever he got to the next level and under the right sort of setting would be able to develop into a really nice player. So what's next? As we go into official visit season, among other things, what's been talked about so much over the course of this recruiting cycle, which is offensive line recruiting for Oklahoma, essentially steps into the spotlight. You've got OV set up with a number of your top targets remaining, and in talking to people both around the program and then down here in like the state of Texas, out on the recruiting trail in general, there are a lot of folks who are really interested to see how this shakes out for OU as far as how they assert themselves with the top remaining targets available, because if you look at it, still a lot of those top dudes are remaining for the taking. You've got Ty Haywood, Lamont Rogers, Michael Fasusi, Andrew Babalola, who we haven't talked about a ton, but he will be officially visiting with Oklahoma over the summer, and I believe he's a Champion Barbecue attendee, so always kind of interesting when you get a guy like that at a major event, especially late on in the OV slate. But then there's some other stuff going on there as well. Darius Afalava, kind of, to me, the last interior offensive line target out there for OU. But what's interesting is that Anthony Ogamoro was actually a big reason why Oklahoma was able to make some inroads with Darius Afalava, because I believe they went to the same kindergarten back in the day, and the families kind of reunited during their visit together at the OU spring game. So that kind of like created an emotional moment that you tie to the university. Well, now that emotional moment doesn't really reside in your favor anymore if you're OU. And then Darius Afalava, oh, by the way, is picking up a lot more recruiting traction since he visited you in the spring. I believe UCLA has set up an official visit. I think they're a serious player with him. I know Ole Miss sent in an offer a couple weeks ago. You can never take the Ole Miss Rebels lightly these days. And so I think that's kind of where things stand. But an interesting little nugget that I picked up while I was, and we'll talk about this more, out on the recruiting trail doing all of my travels. Talking to some folks, man, there isn't a ton of belief that Oklahoma is going to add very many more names, if at all, to this offensive line board, Josh. And why I feel that's relevant, well, you have Owen Hollenbeck, you have Ryan Foje, Anthony Ogamoro is off the board. It sounds like they're interested in potentially trying to experiment with Foje kicking inside. And so Foje, who is a top 100 player for us in our rankings, if he were to move inside the guard, essentially the feedback I'm getting right now is like Oklahoma is going to try and land one, if not two, of these premier offensive tackles out there in the 25 cycle. So that's kind of where things stand. And why I wanted to bring this up, you lose a name like that on the board, but you're not necessarily looking to add all that much. We talked about this a couple weeks ago here on the show. OU's going big game hunting during official visit season. And like the biggest fish, quite literally, because they're like 6'5", 300+ pound offensive tackles, they're still swimming. So if you're not going to be exploring much else as far as other offensive line names, making maybe a few more offers, this is essentially the beginning, as we talk here today, of what Oklahoma is going to essentially view as the pivotal period where they try and make some serious ground with those offensive linemen. And so the last thing I'll say, I am fascinated by how this is going to go, because you look at these offensive linemen out there, Ty Haywood, Michael Fasusi, Andrew Babalola, Lamont Rogers, Darius Afalava. Well, yes, you're in decent position or better with a lot of these guys, but I also, just kind of reading the tea leaves here, don't know that Oklahoma is a slam dunk for any of them. And I would argue that wasn't necessarily the case even a couple of weeks ago. So
Yeah.
As Oklahoma goes into official visit season, man, it's going to be interesting to see not just how Bill Bedenbaugh handles this, because he's been recruiting these guys now for years. How Brent Venables and this Oklahoma staff chooses to essentially go all in or not on these offensive linemen, to me, is going to shape a cycle where after getting all your defensive linemen in 2024, this kind of felt like the cycle where you needed to get the offensive linemen in 2025 ahead of that move to the SEC and all the talk about shoring up the trenches. Well, as things stand today, now is going to have to be the time that you do so, but it's not going to be easy either, especially with a limited amount of names remaining.
It's really interesting, because like you said, I mean, you have a couple of nice building blocks, especially obviously Foje, who's, as of now, the highest rated guy in this class of their 15 guys, at least on our board. Like you said, top 100 player in the class period. And then Owen Hollenbeck there as well. So you kind of have the pieces, if you could find a way to add a couple of these other names we talk about a lot, your Haywoods, your Lamont Rogers, where you could really have a heck of a group here. So it's very interesting. Like you said, there's not a lot of new names will be added. It's kind of either these guys or nobody, which is interesting. So it's going to be fascinating to keep an eye on as we move into the summer. Like you said, official visit season is upon us as we get ready to shift into June, and it's going to be Champion Barbecue. All that stuff is coming up. It's been a lot going on since we did the last show you and I did 2 weeks ago. There's been top fives, top sixes, decision dates being set. There's been visits locked in. I mean, it's been a lot of things happening. You've been all over it, obviously, on the website. If you're a VIP subscriber and keep up with Students Illustrated, you're aware of a lot of these things. But just kind of, I guess, for you, for listeners, viewers tuned in on YouTube, just, I guess, a little bit of a roundup in terms of what are some other things that you're keeping an eye on right now as we get ready to shift into June. What are kind of some storylines that are of highest interest to you, at least as of now?
Yeah, so as far as some of the stuff that I was able to gather from the road, driving around Houston and some other places, let me start in 2025. So these official visits, macro storyline. How Oklahoma ends up handling the defensive line recruiting process over official visit season and beyond, to me, is very intriguing, because one of the stops that I made the final few days in Houston was to Fort Bend Christian Academy. I went out to see Max Granville, the highly ranked edge rusher who has Oklahoma, Texas A&M, Baylor, Penn State towards the top. USC is in the mix as well. Got to talk to him for about 20 to 25 minutes. Graciously pulled himself out of the lunch period to come hang out with me and share the latest on his recruiting. And I think why I bring this up, you have Max Granville, who is a longtime Oklahoma priority target, but I still feel like there's a lot of work still left to do. But then you've got guys like Christian Evans, Cole Breeler, Cade Peterzak, kind of at that defensive tackle to hybrid interior defensive line presence. They're all still out there. And you have CJ Nixon, who remains available, one of the highest ranked in-state recruits that is on your board. He's at that edge defensive end position. You've got a lot of names, but oh, by the way, you got a decent amount of dudes committed. You got Trent Wilson, you got Kamori Moore, you've got an edge rusher, and Alexander Shield Knight. So for me, a macro storyline that's kind of emerged is we know the offensive line stuff's going to be heavily debated by Oklahoma fans during official visit season, but the defensive line recruiting side of this equation is fascinating because there's still a ton of guys out there. And in a cycle where OU is also relatively limited from a spots perspective, don't necessarily know how they're going to handle this thing. And so I guess it's kind of the last thing I'll say as far as the defensive line stuff. It's the beautiful luxury and insignificant problem that Oklahoma now faces with this defensive staff, right? Like, we never really talked about Oklahoma having to juggle a ton of defensive line names once upon a time. Right. And so now you're trying to sift through all of these different scholarship spots and these significant recruits who are evaluating your program. And it's going to be interesting to see how many defensive linemen Oklahoma is willing and able to take, because a lot of them will be officially visiting at a time where you have three guys who I think are pretty quality players already committed. Another overall storyline, the underclassmen recruiting as we go into the summer months, to me, is really interesting. Another stop that I made when I was in Houston was to Fort Bend Marshall, and I checked in with Isaiah Williams. And a quick funny story on Isaiah Williams. We had a great conversation about OU and recruiting and everything. So kind of the consensus about Isaiah Williams and then Markel Ford from Mesquite Horn, same high school as Lamont Rogers. We've talked about him a couple times. It's kind of funny talking to a lot of college sources, like Isaiah Williams and Markel Ford are sort of like the consensus top two safeties in this region on a lot of college boards. But the funniest part is that those two have come to find that out because not only have they heard that, or now that they've seen that because they're being recruited by like the same schools, they've literally learned that from each other because they end up taking a lot of visits together on accident. And it's like, they didn't actually really know much about each other until I believe it was like Markel Ford was telling us at a Mesquite Horn practice. He was just like, yeah, I was told some Fort Bend Marshall kid's supposed to be as good as me. And all of a sudden he was at like every trip that I was on too. So Isaiah Williams, I caught up with him. He was really looking forward to his Oklahoma visits when I talked to him last time in person, which was several months ago. Reading the tea leaves there, I can tell he really likes Oklahoma, Texas, Ohio State, a couple other programs in this region. But then I was going to go to the Duncanville High School spring game here in Dallas-Fort Worth after my trip to Houston. That got canceled, but kind of talked to some folks out there. Really surprising, kind of in 2026, that same cycle. OU traditionally or historically has kind of struggled with that part of the DFW Metroplex, Duncanville, DeSoto, even Lancaster to a degree. But Oklahoma's very much in the picture for guys like Kevin Ford, Zachary Turner, some talented players at Duncanville High. So that's another thing kind of making my rounds is talking to a lot of these underclassmen. Yes, you have your 2025 targets on campus for their senior official visits, but don't forget, folks, like underclassmen will be visiting campuses as well over the summer. So how OU chooses to recruit the younger guys at a time where, again, they don't really have to recruit a ton of names in 2025, I'm interested in. Real quick, I do find it interesting. I was at an O-line camp as well. I've been all over the place. I was at an O-line camp and saw a 2026 offensive tackle by the name of Khalil Sonogo, who OU has shown a lot of interest in. And so when I learned he was going to be at this camp that I was going to, I was like, all right, that's going to be a fun in-person eval. Mm-hmm. Very impressed with him. Legit like 6'5", 285 type build and just scratching the surface of his potential. That's a 2026 type, and people forget more offers are going to go out over the summer because we're heading into both official visit season. We're also going into mega camp season. I'll be at SMU and TCU this weekend. I'll be at North Texas, and then I'll be at Oklahoma like 5 times over the course of June.
Yeah.
OU is going to start going into an evaluation period of sorts. Like, they're going to send out more offers to these younger cats, and then you have to recruit them as well. So that kind of ties into my other thing. And then the last thing I want to say, going back to 2025. So you've got quarterback, running back, corner DB kind of taken care of outside of like an Amarian Robinson or, I mean, Lord only knows what's going to happen with Jonah Williams, right? Linebackers kind of interesting. You're essentially taking care of their defensive line. Apparently you're cooking. So it kind of feels like offensive line remains. And then what is OU going to do at wide receiver? Official visit season. Talking to a couple of sources while I was traveling the Houston Metroplex, I'm buying some stock in Oklahoma's standing with Andrew Marsh. It does sound like the Sooners are making some ground there with the high 4-star wide receiver out of Katy Jordan. But then Quincy Porter recently dropped his top 6. That's another highly ranked 4-star player. OU will actually be the last official visit on the slate for Quincy Porter, June 21st for the Champion Barbecue. That's another guy that high up on the board for obvious reasons. Emmanuel Choice, Lancaster wideout, big 6'4" target as well. OU's long been in the mix with him. Still think OU's in a good spot there, and the list goes on. We know that like the spot that they have to fill is offensive line. during the official visit slate. The spot that they really need to choose how to fill during OV season is going to be wide receiver, in my opinion.
Right.
Because you can probably only take one more, maybe two if you stretch it. And it sounds like Oklahoma is actually in kind of an advantageous position with a lot of these names. Now, again, that's just as things stand today. And Quincy Porter's got a number of official visits. Andrew Marsh is still being coveted by programs like Texas A&M, Michigan, Penn State, so on and so forth. Emmanuel Choice, by the way, I believe TCU is very high up there for him. Texas A&M has an official visit. Nebraska is on the official visit slate. I'm keeping an eye on them as well. So that's kind of my last storyline as we get to start OV season, is like, we know the macro offensive line, they got to get a lot of those bodies in. But who are they going to end up choosing as far as wide receiver to essentially round out this skill class? We could talk about tight end or whatever. That's a whole other tangent, but I'm fascinated about wide receiver recruiting for OU in 2025, because official visit season to me is where they're really going to have to figure out how they want to attack the remainder of that position group for the cycle.
Feels like we're set up for a really fun summer. You look at this, and I know you talked about some underclassmen that'll be making their way here soon, but you've talked about that 25 class. That's our number 3 class right now, both composite and in our own rankings at 24/7 Sports. And you look at some of the fish that are hanging out there that are going to be making their way. I see Champion Barbecue's coming up in a few weeks. And just the last couple of summers, especially, since Brent Venables took over, it's we're kind of getting into that season where it feels like it's like boom, 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 boom. They start to really rack them up quick. So we're teed up, I think, for a fun next couple of months. I think you and I are going to have a lot to talk about on these Thursday shows. Is that the sense you get too as well? Like, this summer is setting up to be a pretty eventful one for Oklahoma on the recruiting side. There's going to be a lot of movement here.
I'm going to have a hard time talking just because of how busy it's about to get, but we will have a lot to talk about. Godspeed to not only people who cover recruiting, but if you're a recruiting fan, you know the about month to 2 month stretch we're about to enter. And what is a 24/7, 365-day world that is recruiting? It's about to get as busy as it gets. And I'm trying to figure out if I can't wait for it or I am just absolutely dreading all the action that's about to take place.
It's going to be something. Like I said, we're going to have plenty to talk about on these Thursday shows. Great time to become a VIP subscriber, of course. The Sooners Illustrated. We're about to shift into summer. The season is kind of sneaky near. I think I did the math today, and it was like 92 days from the opener. So we're kind of getting there. So become a VIP subscriber now. Collin's got you completely covered. VIP recruiting stuff and portal stuff is still kind of happening, and elsewhere with the team as we get ready to shift obviously into summer, and then the season will be here before you know it as well. As far as to kind of wrap up, we'll shift over to the hardwood a little bit here on the back end. I've talked about this a lot over the last couple of months. It's been kind of the thing hanging out there for Oklahoma. What is Jalon Moore going to do? Is he going to come back? We all assumed he would. That's been the long belief. It happened last night. The deadline for players to pull their name out of the NBA draft pool was yesterday morning, and Jalon Moore did just that. He'll be back in Oklahoma next year. This is obviously huge. I was able to report to our VIP subscribers earlier in the day yesterday that Jalon had indeed pulled his name out of the pool, and that there was an expectation that he was going to announce his return probably that day, maybe by today, but he did last night announce his comeback to Oklahoma. It goes without saying that you had to have Jalon Moore back, right, Collin? This was the guy who's going to be your number one option going into next year. It doesn't take any sort of basketball genius to tell you that, a guy who's going to be your number one option, you probably need him. This is a team that's had a ton of turnover. We've talked about it a lot. The roster is got a ton of new faces on it again, but to have Jalon Moore at the top of it, leading the charge, obviously huge for Porter Moser and company. And just the entire kind of vibe of this team going into next year was going to be vastly different if you did not have Jalon Moore on the team, and they do. So this was a huge win to get him back. And he'll play one more year before heading off to the NBA next year. But huge win, obviously, for Oklahoma. They had to have this.
Yeah, and I think our guy Isaac Trotter, who's a national basketball reporter for us, 24/7 Sports, does an outstanding job what was interesting to me was before Jalon Moore even announced this decision, of course, we kind of knew this was coming, right? It wasn't hard to read the tea leaves here. He essentially shared his way too early SEC basketball preseason rankings. And he actually included Jalon Moore in the starting five for Oklahoma relative to their ceiling. Slotted Oklahoma at 12 out of 16. Now, why do I bring that up? Very telling. This isn't necessarily a group that is going to blow you away on paper. But with the addition of Jalon Moore, it does one of two things. It prevents you from being 16, right? I don't think you're doing very well without him. But now with him there, one thing that Trotter said in the article, Porter Moser sometimes tends to do more with less. And Jalon Moore is certainly more. Like, this is a very talented player, and he's kind of the heartbeat of the team. So if anything, it gives you some sort of relative floor to work with. And maybe Oklahoma can exceed expectations with their leader back in the program. I'm interested by it, man. I don't know how exactly this is going to go, but you had to have him back. You got it. And now you're going to have to work through him to elevate this team's overall output.
100%. And my understanding of the situation here is that Jalon Moore is ready to embrace being the guy, like kind of face of the program, and that's what he's going to be going into next year. Like you said, he has the right kind of personality for it, but then also his play style is just so fun. I mean, he was a really entertaining player to watch last season. He's an athletic freak of nature. The way he can get up and dunk the ball, he screams, shows lots of emotion on the court. He's a really fun player to watch. And so another year for him to develop, and he's ready to slide into that. And that's kind of, I think, was a big part of the selling point on getting him to not enter the portal in the first place was, hey, man, like, we're going to put some pieces around you. We're going to build around you going into next year. And I think he liked that idea. And so here you are. He's coming back. The roster is set. Now, they haven't officially announced the signing of Mohamed Wagi yet from Alabama. He's the only one still hanging out there. Once he signs, the roster will be the full scholarship limit. And so we have the team here. We'll see what they look like going into next year. But, yeah, this was obviously huge. And we talked about it all offseason, that the expectation was that he would be back, right? But with the way this offseason has gone for OU basketball, you're scared to count your chickens before they hatch with anything. So have that officially last night, him announced, like, I am back. Let's make another run at this thing. It is huge. I think OU fans can feel pretty good about that. And that'll be a face that, they'll can recognize. Him and Sam Godwin will be the two starters back from last year's team that they can kind of to build on moving into next year. So huge win. They had to have that, obviously. All right, I think that's it. I'll be back with Tom and James on Monday. SEC spring meetings are this week. Tom's had a lot of great content coming out of that. If you're not on the site, you should be, obviously, anyway. But go head over there and check that out. He's had a bunch of great things from Brent Venables, Joe Castiglione as well. We'll be sure to get into a lot of that, I think, on the Monday show. We'll also talk about WCWS for OU softball. They open up today. Shocker, their first game got delayed with weather. That's an every year thing right there. And also the baseball regionals starting this weekend as well in Norman. I'll be getting up to that. So a lot to talk about on Monday. And then I'll be back with CK here next Thursday to hit some more recruiting stuff as we flip the calendar into June next week. So CK, appreciate you, man. It was weird having the week off, but we're back. And hopefully we can get back on a normal schedule moving into what's going to be a crazy summer.
I'll tell you this, man, just a little cherry on the top for folks who want to really realize what time of the year we're in. 1 week from today, Josh Callaway and I will be watching recruits run around on OU's campus because first Brent Venables Elite Camp, naturally, June 6th, that Thursday. Who knows? Do we do an in-person podcast? Do we just sweat it out and figure it out later? It's going to be a busy few months, folks, but we're looking forward to it. Yeah.
That's a good point. I didn't really think about that. You're going to be up here. We might do a little something. We'll figure it out. We'll hopefully, boy, those things are so hot. Those things are so hot. Get the sunscreen ready. It's getting to that time of year. All right, we'll sign off for now. For Collin Kenny, I'm Josh Callaway. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast and to the YouTube channel. We'll see you back here next week right here on the Sooners Illustrated podcast.